Blood Trails, written by Ian Smith. Part 1. I was 19 years old in the late summer of 1997 when my maternal grandfather suddenly became ill and passed away. He was 72 years old, and in the span of only 5 short precurring weeks, he was diagnosed with a particularly aggressive form of pancreatic cancer, went to hospice care, declined, and finally passed away on a Tuesday in late August. The whole affair had been quite stressful and emotionally draining, especially for my mother, who had been quite close to him throughout her life. What was most distressing was how quickly it all passed. Hardly enough time for him, his estranged wife, or his only daughter to get his affairs in order. And when he finally lost the battle, many issues remained unsettled. The principal issue that took some time to resolve was what would become of his few possessions, an issue complicated by the nature of what was left behind. He was tenured professor of anthropology at the University of Texas in Austin, a man of some academic distinction, as I later learned, who specialized in the study of Native American cultures. And he left behind a veritable treasure trove of academic materials and historical documents. Why he left those to us is beyond me, since it would be better served if these materials were donated to the university for use by his former colleagues. But at the time, I believed it was simply an oversight on his part. I, myself, was fairly upset by the loss. Although I had drifted apart from my mother's side of the family over the years, this wasn't over any personal issues, but simply a matter of distance. He was living in Texas, and our family was living in suburban Denver, and the years had offered few opportunities to visit or to get to know him. However, I was much closer to him as a child when we visited more often, and I'd like to think he was the one who inspired my own passion for human and social sciences. At the time of his passing, I had just completed my freshman year of college at the University of Colorado in Boulder and was gearing up to begin my sophomore year, my chosen major being anthropology, like my grandfather. Fast forward just over 20 years, and I myself am a professor of anthropology. Although my area of expertise is Mississippian cultures of the pre-Columbian era, while his the study of the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona. Until this point, I had largely forgotten the quantity of academic materials he had left us, since they were mostly collecting dust in my parents' attic. Although bits and pieces had been donated to the university over the years, it wasn't until the holidays when I was visiting my parents that I remembered anything about them, and being an academic myself, it occurred to me just how valuable these precious historical artifacts could be. Out of intellectual curiosity, and looking for a possible subject of research for a paper I was preparing, I took possession of these materials for my own use. The documents were kept in a quite ancient engraved wooden chest, some of which were my grandfather's own research notes, while others were a collection of old books and census reports going all the way back to the 1870s. But the most intriguing of the bunch was a letter-bound journal, into which was tucked a series of annotations written by my grandfather during his own research. It was this journal that piqued my interest, even though it was a more modern source than what my area of expertise entails, but I was interested nonetheless. The journal was written by a man named Joseph Sheridan, my grandfather's great-grandfather, and I was immediately excited by this find, if only for its importance to our family's history. My mother was quite interested in genealogy and actually kept quite an extensive family tree, where I located this mysterious Joseph. I immediately dived into researching about this man, who I learned was actually an agent of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency in the 1880s, and was actually a man of some renown. In 1880, he was the one credited with capturing Miguel Canales, a bandit chief who terrorized South Texas for several years prior. And in 1884, he shot and killed a notorious Utah cattle rustler and thief named Lawrence Red Cobb, earning a $150 bounty in the process. Being something of an Old West aficionado myself, I was quite enthusiastic about the find and set myself to reading his journal. I spent the next week reading the journal cover to cover, and now that I have completed it, I'm not sure I feel quite the same way. In fact, I'm not sure just how I feel about having read it at all. It might be cliché to say that I regret it, but in a strange way, even though I can't quite process what was written in it, I'm glad I know, even though I feel some dread about what he wrote possibly being true. In his journal, he chronicles the pursuit of an outlaw band across New Mexico, Arizona, and down into Mexico itself, which took place in late 1889. What follows is something so bizarre, so twisted and horrible, that I'm not sure I even believe that any of it is true. It is quite possible that his writings were just the product of a disturbed mind, but reading it and seeing its sincerity firsthand, I can't imagine why he might fabricate something so strange. It's been a few weeks since I completed reading it, and I still can't decide whether or not I believe it, what any of it might mean. I think perhaps you fine people ought to read it for yourself and make your own decisions. I've taken the liberty of transcribing the journal in its entirety for you to read, with a few small interjections here and there, but completely preserved, and so, I suppose, here goes nothing. July 28th, 1889, Denver, Colorado. I had my first meeting with one of the men in charge at the Denver field office this morning. A man named J.M. Withers. Must admit, I rather dislike him, rather brisk and lacking in professional courtesy, but brief and succinct. Described the details of new assignment, a long one, he estimates 2 months of work and high risk, but he claims I was one of the first considered for it. Thought perhaps it was a clumsy attempt at flattery, but I'm still interested. No family obligations to tend to, perhaps sobriety and fresh air will do me some good. Job pays $5,000 upon completion, and that is an individual reward too, not split amongst the others. Should mention, the job is a 5-man operation including myself, though Mr. Withers would not say who else was offered. Claims the precise details are to be known only by those chosen for the task. I rather dislike having details withheld, but $5,000 plus expense is a worthy trade. July 29th, 1889, Denver, still. Met again with Mr. Withers, still dislike him. Anyhow, I made it clear that I would accept, and he followed through with the specifics. 5-man team, including myself, pursuing a suspect in a number of murders committed throughout Arkansas, Union territories, and Texas. Offered no further specifics than that, but instead disclosed a dossier detailing the suspect and all pertinent information. Claims that the information in the dossier is for my eyes only, and I can disclose pertinent details to the 4 others at my discretion. This caveat I found to be rather strange, as I am unaccustomed to this level of secrecy, even with the Pinkertons. I will have a look at the dossier later. Try to determine why exactly the identity of this man is kept confidential, possibly politically sensitive. I should save speculations for later. August 1st, 1889, Las Vegas, New Mexico territory. Read the full dossier on the train from Denver. Miserable train journey as well. All that money and the Pinkertons won't spare a cent more than they have to for travel expenses. Had to ride a rather packed carriage. Anyhow, I'm now staying in a hotel in Las Vegas on the New Mexico territory. In 2 days I will meet with the others, and then we shall depart on our mission. The dossier report states that the trail of our suspect seems to lead to a point some miles southwest of here, where we will reacquire the trail and pursue it wherever it leads, even into Mexico if the trail should point this way, although they were quite clear that we could not depend upon any official support should this become necessary. August 1st, 1889, Addendum, Las Vegas, still. Still have some time to spare as I await my comrades in this mission, so I have studied further on just who we are pursuing, or why the urgency that demanded a sudden departure. Pursuit across the desert at the height of summer season seems quite foolish to me, but as I understand, the urgency is so great, and the risk of the trail being lost so compelling, that we are expected to trudge across the desert in the middle of August. Mr. Withers and the others did not say much about sharing information within the dossier, other than that it was not to be expressed to any others outside of our group. Still, they did not say anything about documenting the details in our personal writings, so I will write down some details here, for posterity if nothing else. Our subject is a man by the name of Deacon Chogan, aliases Red Horse, Peacock, and Black Heron, among others. Even the given name Deacon Chogan is a matter of conjecture. Subject is thought to be around 50 years old, perhaps older, some Amanvinian ancestry and either a half-breed or quarter-breed, though is thought to mostly resemble a white man. The given name was determined by a record of a student at the Presbyterian Cemetery in Kentucky from 1853, whom they have determined is the subject in question. As far as is known, this is the only official documentation of his existence. Thought to have been born in the Creek Nation, though this and his exact age are indeterminate. A man of religious inclinations, his denomination or exact faith are unknown or undocumented. He has apparently lived and traveled in the Indian Territories for much of his life, has known no criminal record under the assumed name of Deacon Chogan, though it is possible that he might have some under other names. Even this is not clearly known. Reports of religious movement in the Choctaw Creek and Seminole Nations name one of his aliases, Red Horse, as the principal figure in a series of disturbances in the region. Crimes among the Indians in the territories are not always well documented, but the U.S. Marshal's Office in Fort Smith did provide some speculation that he was involved in some other known cases, possibly under an unknown alias. They describe him as a very angry and treacherous individual, leading a group of like-minded religious fanatics. If this is true, then I can see why they are concerned with apprehending him, given the anxieties expressed by the federal government regarding the ghost dancers of Dakota. While the subject is described as a religious figure, none can quite say that they know anything of his professed faith. Perhaps some native superstitions, or, given his Christian education, something of a more biblical bend. Some speculate that it might be devil worship in some form, involving animal and even human sacrifice. Subject was largely unknown until 8 months ago, when named as a suspect in several murders in Arkansas and later tentatively linked in similar crimes in Mississippi and as far east as Georgia. The murders in question are thought to be the work of several individuals in addition to our prime suspect. The reports themselves are frustratingly unclear about precise details or circumstances of the crimes. The reports do disclose rather macabre details, grotesque mutilations, gouging of eyes even, some reference of flaying. Others describe strange symbols marked upon the remains and unusual totems left at the scene. These symbols and totems are what led speculation of native involvement, though none of the Indians who were part of the investigating force could recognize them. But it was clear, according to the investigating officers, that there was some mark of religious ceremony regarding these murders. Number of victims total is labeled at 19, not including those crimes which have not been conclusively linked with our suspect. Such hideous displays of violence call into question the nature of the man who committed them. For how little we know about this Deacon Chogan figure, we know even less about his compatriots. The dossier is quite specific that what is known or believed regarding these men is purely conjectural, and among our directives is to attempt to identify as many of these men as possible. According to rumors and assumptions, many of our subject's followers are thought to be white men, many of possibly mixed ancestry, and some full-blooded Indians as well as African-American freedmen are speculated to be among their numbers. As of yet, the precise racial composition of the group is still largely unknown, and in fact, there are no precise estimates as to the size of this group, which some reports speculate varying amount from as few as 15 to as many as 100. But what is most remarkable about all of this is how few of these details and assumptions have clearly documented sources. Police reports are generally authentic records, which offered some insight into the nature of these crimes, but other statements about our suspect's identity, motives, and his accomplices are made as definite statements with no clear records or sources. Whoever compiled this dossier was either sloppy or failed to appreciate that every possible detail, even the source itself, is relevant in such an investigation. Or perhaps there was some ulterior motive in withholding this information. Anyhow, I have been writing for quite some time, and so I will stop at this and pursue the dossier later and report my further musings. August 3rd, 1889. Las Vegas, New Mexico Territory. No entry for yesterday, nothing noteworthy. Just carousing in the saloon and purchasing some additional tack and supplies. I even purchased a bottle of rye for my own private reserve. Can't always trust the water out there. More importantly, my comrades in arms for this mission just arrived in town today, and we gathered at the saloon for the appropriate introductions. Besides myself, there are 4 men who will take on the specific responsibilities of our company. First was a tall, burly fellow with a prominent red beard named R.J. Hannigan, a very jocular and pleasant individual with an infectious good humor. He will be our appointed expert on matters of survival in the wilderness, who will maintain our stores of provisions or what little we can carry without a wagon. Second was our wrangler, who will attend our horses and tack, a man named Wilfred Sharpie. He is rather the opposite of Hannigan, being a very sullen and easily agitated man who made numerous complaints right away, and did not offer to shake hands. Third is the tracker, an Indian chap who only goes by the name of William, rather than the more typical native epithet. I believe he is either a Creek or a Seminole, though I didn't inquire. He's a rather quiet and stoic man, as Indians are known to be, but still projected an air of competence that I found reassuring. And lastly is a fellow agent like myself, named Henry Quinn. I rather like him as well, and though he is not as humorous or cordial as Hannigan, he is still quite agreeable and listened intently to our conversations. Almost immediately, Mr. Hannigan began to lecture us about survival tactics in the rugged desert, and given my previous apprehensions about pursuing a party across the desert in the midst of August, I was quite interested in what he had to say. According to him, daytime temperatures will routinely exceed 100 degrees, though, as he points out, the situation is not much different here in town. Other than that, we have ready access to supplies and shelter. We will be eating light and sleeping relatively little, and spending as much time of the day in the saddle as we can, so as to make good time with as little expenditure of supplies and provisions as possible. Sharpie kept piping in with his own questions and seemed unimpressed with Hannigan's reassurances, but Hannigan sticks by them. William seemed to concur with Hannigan, or at least he did not object, as did Quinn. If the heat is too trying, he says, we can always opt to rest during the day and travel at night to avoid the worst of it. I admit I don't know that much about survival in the wilderness, but I will defer to Hannigan's recommendations. Sharpie has provided our horses, which were actually shipped in this morning on the train. I received a standard quarter-horse mare, actually a rather fine filly, who is rather well trained. Whatever Sharpie's misgivings about us, he has an excellent way with horses, and speedily prepared our tack and saddles. Quinn has provided our weapons, a Winchester repeating carbine and a Colt single-action army for each of us, all chambered in 44-40 for convenience, with several dozens of shells for each of us. However, while I appreciate having the rifle, I think I will stick with my Colt Frontier double-action revolver instead. Even though it takes a different cartridge, still, having 2 pistols just may come in handy, depending on what we find. William has taken charge of our maps and compass, and I will be right at his side directing our expedition. I must admit, perhaps my previous apprehensions about my comrades were unfounded. All things considered, I couldn't have asked for a more competent team. August 5th, 1889. 20 to 25 miles southwest of Las Vegas, New Mexico territory. First day on the trail, made 23 miles by my estimation. Departed at 6 o'clock this morning, before the worst heat, and I am rather satisfied with our pace. Yesterday evening, we gathered for supper as Hannigan advised we should try to eat a large meal before departing, as we will not have the opportunity to eat much for quite some time. We stopped some 6 miles short of our first destination, where we are meant to pick up the trail. I considered having the party push on to this point during the first day, but given the conditions, I decided against it to avoid pushing ourselves and the horses too hard early on. I believe spirits are relatively high, since we have now gotten to the task at hand rather than all the insufferable waiting. William, the Indian, has shown himself a highly competent navigator as well as a tracker. Hannigan is notably more quiet now that we are on the trail, but resumed his joking demeanor once we made camp. He advised that we keep our campfire some yards away from where we sleep, so as to avoid revealing our presence in unsettled country. Sounds rather inconvenient, so I countered by saying we could do so later on when we were closer to our intended goal. He seemed to agree. Regarding our mission, today I disclosed some of the relevant details to my comrades, and I was surprised they did not inquire much further. I told them the name of our suspect, his general description, some of his alleged crimes, and where they happened, and told them about the number of men thought to be following him. Oddly enough, they all seemed to take the information in stride, asking few questions. Must be tired from our time in the saddle. The country south of Las Vegas is rather rugged and sparse, but the evening hours were still relatively pleasant. We set up camp on a small hillock some 300 yards off the trail, with some amount of scrub brush surrounding it, which will hopefully deter any prowling hostiles during the night. The rest are preparing to turn in, for we will depart at sunup tomorrow to complete the next leg of our journey. Now that the temperature has dropped, I think I can sleep comfortably, and am quite confident about the days ahead. August 6th, 1889. Somewhere south of the Pecos River Valley, New Mexico territory. I have slept on the ground many nights in my life, but it has never gotten any more pleasant. Thankfully, some of the evening sounds in the high desert are rather relaxing and conducive to sleep. That said, I think my general feeling of well-being has diminished a bit since yesterday. I ought to get used to it by now, as we will be spending many more days on the trail. Still, a fairly productive day. We awoke at dawn as planned, and I saw that the hill upon which our camp was set overlooked a small valley with the Pecos River running through it. At least, I think it's the Pecos, according to our map. I didn't notice this in the waning twilight yesterday evening, although I knew we should be getting close. We reached the point where we are meant to pick up the trail at 9:30 o'clock in the morning, and upon seeing the area I was rather discouraged at first. The point on the map turned out to be a small cliff overlooking an arroyo at the base of a hill that William claims is called Mesa Sola, and upon arriving, there seemed to be no obvious sign of human presence. I was frustrated with myself for not pushing on the previous evening, but looking back, we would have arrived here in darkness and been at even greater disadvantage. There is a small ranch some 2 miles north of here, and I considered going there to question the locals about any strange happenings or notable travelers, but I decided against it. Still, not all was in vain. William and Hannigan surveyed the area and pointed out that small tracks did remain, having been hastily and imperfectly covered up. This is a compelling find, and has meant that our prior intelligence seems to be somewhat accurate after all. We considered that the tracks might be those of another party and not necessarily our quarry, but the obscurity of this area and the fact that the tracks showed signs of being deliberately covered pointed to our previous assumptions being correct. William immediately began following the traces, and thus our pursuit finally begun in earnest. August 7th, 1889. 2 miles south of some place called Arroyo Calaveras, New Mexico. I spent yesterday evening ruminating about certain details that have become more apparent now. One thought that kept coming to mind was regarding our prior intelligence, as to how and where we should reacquire the trail of our suspect. This was one of those details in the briefing that had no real source but was stated with great emphasis, and which turned out to be correct. And now I wonder, how exactly did they come by this intelligence? I thought about how I was never told if any others before us were on Chogan's trail. I considered how the report used the passive tense when regarding any previous attempts to pursue him and never mentioned any specifics about who. Indeed, since the last definitive report of his crime occurred in northern Texas, I wonder how they were able to confidently track his whereabouts to that exact spot. I might discuss these thoughts with my comrades later. We spent much of yesterday and today following an actual trail, and our pace has slowed down considerably. Now we are often pausing to examine clues and traces. We are making less than 10 miles in a day. It seems our quarry has taken some great pains to conceal his passing, but not enough to deter an astute tracker. Currently, the trail is pointing away south. I have rather mixed feelings about this. I'm hoping that the trail might divert west rather than potentially lead us into Mexico, which I am hoping to avoid. However, further south is more settled country, which is good news if we need to procure further supplies, though resting is out of the question. We have tried to eat and drink sparingly in spite of the heat and long days, but there is only so much we can tolerate. Hannigan, in particular, needs much to eat, as the man is probably 6'6" and quite large, and always in need of food under his belt. For now, we have made our camp on the open country, and perhaps tomorrow we can discuss where to find provisions and if we should question the locals. August 9th, 1889. Near Estancia, New Mexico. Haven't written in a few days, nothing too notable in that time. The trail has veered a bit westward to my relief. In the morning we debated traveling to a nearby town called Estancia. We came to the consensus that we should at least try to find an opportunity to resupply, though we are not in agreement about questioning the locals. I, for one, am against it, as even though following the trail is slow and weary work, we are not likely to obtain any useful information from the locals, and we might risk the secrecy of our mission, or even be misdirected by local rumors. William and I are in agreement. Hannigan is decidedly neutral, while Quinn and Sharpie, especially Sharpie, are getting impatient with our progress. As the leader of our group, I made an executive call to all of them to refrain from questioning the locals. The town of Estancia itself is rather pitiful, being only a very small trading post. The local general store was not particularly well stocked, but we more or less found what we required. Apart from this, nothing truly notable. I have mostly spent the day thinking further about our situation. I have revealed further details in the dossier to the others, but again they seem relatively undisturbed and asked few questions. Now I'm wondering if perhaps they already know some of these details themselves. Were they briefed individually beforehand? I was led to believe through my orders that these men were unaware of the specifics, and that it was my responsibility to reveal to them as necessary. I can't say for certain, but I'm rather exhausted, so perhaps my mood is being affected negatively. Rest and a nip of rye might do me some good. I've been abstaining these last several days, so I think I've earned it. August 9th, 1889. Addendum. By God, I am bloody goddamn irritated with Sharpie. I haven't expressed it before, but it has been growing on me ever since we left. His interjections, unsolicited comments, and general complaining have been a steady feature of his company. But until now I have been ignoring it successfully and refusing to engage with him worked for a time. But now I hear this fool went against my explicit orders and has been interrogating the locals about the men we are pursuing. He hasn't grasped that the locals are already wary of us, a group of strangers in these parts who go about conspicuously armed, and his questioning could throw suspicion on us. We could find ourselves the target of the local law if we aren't careful. I let him know this is the sternest possible terms, and he's been sulking for the past hour, muttering under his breath. I'll say it now. If that glorified stable hand doesn't shut his mouth and stick to caring for the horses, I'll smack him in the next week. I'm also fairly annoyed with Quinn, as well, for not stifling Sharpie during their trip into town. But Quinn seems generally repentant, so I'll avoid antagonizing him. That is all. I simply need to express this before it boils over.